Welcome to today's webinar on the future of Hong Kong's democracy. Where does Hong Kong go? I want to welcome in particular our two guests of honor today, Martin Lee and Alan Leung from Hong Kong. Thank you for being with us, gentlemen. They both have extremely distinguished CVs, and we don't have the time to expand on that, but I would say they're very good friends. Both of them, as barristers, are men of the law. Both have fought very long for the rule of law and for democracy. Both have been members of the Legislative Council of Hong Kong. Martin Lee, who worked on the basic law and contributed considerably to that, has been dubbed the father of Hong Kong democracy. And Alan Leung is the leader of the Civic Party, a democratic party in Hong Kong that did very well in the recent district elections. Thanks again for being with us. And before we have presentations from Martin and from Alan, and then later on Q&A, I would want to make just a few remarks regarding the housekeeping rules. When you look at the chat, you will find the email address to which you can direct questions that you may want to ask later in the conversation. Please use that email address of my Brussels office, and I can then read questions that have come in. There's no point in raising your hand because we will only go through that written procedure in the Q&A. As we have a big participation, we want to reserve enough time for the Q&A. So both Martin and Alan agreed that they would give a rather limited, maybe 10 to 12 minutes introduction each, and then we would start with the questions. And I would now, without further ado, turn to you. Martin Lee, please take the floor.
Thank you, Rainer, for inviting us. This is a very important time for Hong Kong. Where do we go from here? But let me remind your listeners what happened many years ago. Why is Hong Kong part of China? Now, in the early 1980s, Margaret Thatcher went to Beijing and started negotiations with Deng Xiaoping and his government. And at the time, the British government's position was that new territory of Hong Kong would have to be returned to China on the 1st of July, 1997, because that would be the end, the expiry of a 99-year lease. But Hong Kong and Kowloon were ceded to Britain forever. But China wanted to take back everything. So Margaret Thatcher's position, I understand, was that she would, she would give back Hong Kong, Kowloon and the new territories to China on the 1st of July, 1997. But she wanted China to grant a new lease over the whole of Hong Kong back to the British government for something like 50 years. Deng Xiaoping said no. But Deng Xiaoping was concerned that if China were to simply take back Hong Kong, just like that, a lot of Hong Kong people would leave Hong Kong for fear that there was no future here. And indeed, he was also afraid that overseas investors would pull out of Hong Kong. So he came with a proposition that neither Britain nor China would rule Hong Kong for the first 50 years from the 1st of July, 1997, but Hong Kong people will run Hong Kong, will rule Hong Kong for 50 years with a high degree of autonomy. So his idea was one country, two systems, meaning China would be one system and Hong Kong would be another system. The idea was that the Chinese constitution will govern Big China, called the mainland China now, and the basic law, which is our mini constitution, would govern Hong Kong. It's called the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region. And we were promised that our way of life would be unchanged, all our freedoms would be kept, all our laws would be kept, and that would continue for 50 years. At the end of that, then of course, Hong Kong would be simply part of China, and Hong Kong would be treated and governed by China like any other Chinese city, but not for those 50 years. So that was the big promise. Now, at the time, I said already that it could, but it will be very difficult for that to work because China is so huge and we are so tiny. So I gave the analogy of the seesaw game, which we all played when we were young. If the father sits at this end and the little boy, little Tommy, sits at the other end, it goes like this. And there's no game. And the only way for there to be a game is for the bigger guy, the father, to move towards the center of the plank until an equilibrium is struck. Then there is a game. And I said at the time, there are two very important conditions. The first is that there must be democracy, so that our leaders who have been elected by the people will know that if they want another term, they must be seen to be always defending the Hong Kong system. Otherwise, they will not get another term. That's a very important condition. The other one is that China must not interfere in the affairs of Hong Kong. Otherwise, it's tipped again. So these were the two important conditions, and both were written into the basic law, which is our mini constitution. And I was one of the 23 people from Hong Kong who participated in the drafting process, together with 36 mainland drafters. Now, unfortunately, things didn't work out well. Well, 6 years ago, in June 2014, the Chinese government published a white paper in which it claimed that the central government has comprehensive jurisdiction over Hong Kong. Just think, instead of Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong, it's now the Central People's Government. That's the Communist Party ruling Hong Kong. And instead of giving Hong Kong a high degree of autonomy, now central government has comprehensive jurisdiction. So it's the example of what Deng Xiaoping promised to Margaret Thatcher. Now, why would the rest of the world be concerned with Hong Kong? And there's a little history behind it. Before the Joint Declaration was first announced to Hong Kong people and to the public on the 26th of September 1984, both the Chinese government and the British government worked very hard to lobby for international support. They were afraid that if the outside world were not to support the Joint Declaration, Hong Kong people would lose heart. And so would the overseas investors in Hong Kong. And they will all pull out. So they got and asked for international support, and they got it. And the US government, Canadian government, a lot of European countries and their governments actually came out and supported it strongly and publicly. So Hong Kong people had confidence in our future, and the emigration tide immediately stopped. And we then said, okay, one country, two systems is workable, and we'll try our best to make it work. So I spent from 1985 in drafting the basic law. And so we are still holding China to the big promise that Hong Kong people should rule Hong Kong with a high degree of autonomy. We must have democracy, and Beijing must not interfere. Now, until that's done, Hong Kong we cannot be masters of our own house. Now, Beijing wants to interfere now. They publicly said so in the white paper, and they are actually implementing their new policy instead of the old one. That is a complete departure from the promises made by Deng Xiaoping for the return of Hong Kong. And that is why I hope the international community, which spoke out at the time as a result of lobbying from China, in support of that joint declaration should now speak up and say something is terribly wrong. And China must go back to her own promise and trust Hong Kong people. Let us develop democracy right away, and Beijing must not interfere. So that is the message. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Martin. And before I start asking questions or reading some of the questions that have been sent in, I would propose that, Alan, you give your presentation also.
Thank you, Reinhard. Yes, thank you for making available this webinar. And I agree with Martin that this is a very timely one. Martin gave the audience a very succinct summary of what happened since 1980s, when Margaret Thatcher visited Deng Xiaoping in Beijing and decided on the fate of the then colony, Hong Kong. The Basic Law was promulgated on the 4th of April 1990. So this year actually is the 30th anniversary of the promulgation of the Basic Law. And the past 30 years, if I may say so, is a story of treachery and deceit. And that treacherous behavior and the deceitfulness of the Chinese Communist Party is brought home ever more clearly by how it has dealt with the coronavirus pandemic, and also what is happening on the ground in Hong Kong. Perhaps I can use my 10 minutes to update the audience on what recently is happening on the ground in Hong Kong. But before I say anything about that, I really want to make the point that audience in the rest of the world, particularly in liberal democracies of the world, ought not simply to look at Hong Kong as bystanders. Our experience in dealing with the Chinese Communist Party in the past 30 years and what are happening on the ground in Hong Kong now has a lot of relevance to you in Europe, because you are dealing with the same giant, the same authoritarian regime as we have been dealing with in the past 30 years. So the Hong Kong experience is important to you. If Hong Kong can be of any help in throwing some light on why your dealings with the CCP had happened the way they did in the past, and also can throw some light on what you can expect in the future if you do nothing to avert a cause which you had been pursuing since China's accession to WTO in the year 2001, then today's Hong Kong can easily be your tomorrow. So with that little remark, if I may just highlight a few things that would be of some relevance in our discussion today. You may recall that the first major civil society awakening in Hong Kong happened on the 1st of July 2003, when the then Chief Executive, Tung Chee-hwa, was trying to bulldoze through the Legislative Council the National Security Bill, which is generally described as the Article 23 legislation, national security, to outlaw cardinal sins like treason, sedition, etc. Now, as then reported, 500,000 people took to the streets of Hong Kong on the 1st of July 2003. But after that, the CCP has not responded in the way that Hong Kong people would have expected it to. For example, Martin already touched on 2014 white paper, when the CCP evidently was going against its promises as enshrined in the Basic Law. In 2014, as a result of that white paper and the denial of democracy, universal suffrage in Hong Kong, there was this 79-day Occupy movement in Hong Kong, when the streets of Hong Kong, thoroughfares in Central and also in Kowloon, were occupied for 79 days in total. But nothing came of it. There was no promise of universal suffrage. Quite to the contrary, the iron fist of the CCP actually was grabbing hold of Hong Kong with ever increasing strength and force. What happened recently, I just mentioned maybe a handful of matters that is worth your audience attention. Number one, of course, there was the recent arrest of 15 prominent figures, including our guest speaker today, Mr. Martin Lee, on the 18th of April. High-profile arrests with police officers calling at their home with search warrants and to arrest them and took them to police stations. The second thing that I would want to highlight is that the chairman of the District Council of Central and Western District was arrested for sedition. Sedition is unarguably a political offense, introduced first, I think, in the 17th century by the British monarch to silence any dissenting voice. And what this chairman did had simply been to post on her Facebook the image of a police officer who was identified by many of our young people on the in cyberspace to be the officer who fired at an Indonesian reporter and blinded one of her eyes. And to me, of course, this sedition, the investigation for sedition, is a kind of white horror, if you like, to try to silence people when they exercise freedom of speech. Because you can easily be targeted for sedition investigation if you say anything that the government does not like and you are a political dissident. The third thing that I want to highlight is that only about 2 weeks ago, there was started in Hong Kong a rhetoric by the liaison office and also by the Hong Kong and Macau office in Beijing, endorsed by Hong Kong SAR government, that Article 22 of the Basic Law has taken on a new meaning. Now, what is Article 22? Article 22 says very clearly, if I may read from the text of the Basic Law, that no department of the Central People's Government and no province, autonomous region, or municipality directly under the central government may interfere in the affairs which the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region administers on its own in accordance with this law. Now, this article is really the article at the heart of the Basic Law. As we all know, the Chinese Communist Party is omnipotent per the Chinese Constitution. There is no division of powers. So if it does not seek to restrain its limitless power, then how possibly can the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region enjoy all the rights and freedom that have been promised us and enshrined in the Basic Law? It's impossible. But now they are saying, oh, that has been a mistake in your understanding since the promulgation of the Basic Law in 1990, that the Central People's Government is not interfering with matters within your autonomy. Actually, they have retained and can always exercise a supervisory power over matters in Hong Kong. Now, the most recent example of such an exercise of supervisory power is that they are telling Hong Kong people not to patronize only those restaurants, shops, and retailers in what we call the yellow economic circle. Now, this thing is very simple, that we are in support of democracy, human rights. We want to patronize those shops that are also holding on to the same ideologies, same values as we do. You go to a restaurant for many reasons, and now the director of the Hong Kong Macau, the liaison office, is telling us that is not right because you are not doing what a free market economy would allow. Now, so their supervisory power can be as they can control us in the name of that exercise of that supervisory power as to which shop we should patronize. If that is to be pursued to its logical end, then where possibly can one country, two systems be sustained and preserved? No, it is one country, one system, and it's Beijing people ruling Hong Kong, not Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong. Where's the self-autonomy? Now, maybe not to take up too much time, I just mentioned one last thing that is worth mentioning, is that only, I think yesterday, there was a high-profile announcement of the establishment of the Hong Kong Coalition. Now, this Hong Kong Coalition is headed by two ex-Hong Kong chief executives in the name of Tung Chee-hwa and Leung Chun-ying. And the Secretary General is Mr. Tam Yiu-chung, who is the only Hong Kong delegate on the National People's Congress Standing Committee. And they rallied just over, I think, 1,300 people to join them. And they are saying that these two ex-chief executives would be leading Hong Kong in a direction of revival. Now, I just don't know what they will do, but it seems that this is a kind of people's infighting that the Chinese Communist Party is expert in, right? Since they have come into power in 1949. So people fighting each other, and we are. It seems that we are going in that direction with Hong Kong already divided into the so-called yellow camp and the blue camp. Pro-establishment, pro-Beijing is colored blue, and those who share values and institutions with liberal democracies of the world, and we are still fighting to uphold the one country, two systems promised us by the Basic Law and the Sino-British Joint Declaration, we are colored yellow. So it seems that this establishment of the Hong Kong coalition, in a way, is deepening that divide between the two camps in Hong Kong. If I may say in conclusion that it seems it is high time the liberal democracies of the world will have to take a view on what they are going to do with Hong Kong. Do they still keep Hong Kong as the only place flying the 5-star red flag that shares the same core values, institutions, and in the ideologies as they do, and hoping that one day, by continuing to do business with China, which was started in 2001 with China's accession to WTO, would still one day be able to convert the Chinese Communist Party to embracing the same core values, ideologies, and institutions? Or do you decide to pull out of Hong Kong completely? Now, I venture to suggest that it is in everybody's interest to actually try to continue with the idea which liberal democracies had started 20 years ago in supporting China's accession to WTO. You keep your interest and stake in Hong Kong. You continue to deal with China, but I suppose you should conclude from your experience in the past 20 years and try to negotiate with the CCP so that you can continue to do business on terms that you can better protect yourself and also will facilitate your efficient policing of compliance of a rules-based game. If I may pause here and wait to react to questions.
Thank you very much, Alan. I now have collected quite a few questions, and as I'm going to read them to you, gentlemen, I would propose that maybe you take a few notes, because I will read more than you will be able to remember, and then I would go back to you and give you a chance of answering the questions. So the first two questions are this. Do you expect the Hong Kong government and Beijing to push again for legislation under Article 23 of the Basic Law and how will the public react? Second, will the pan-democrats be able to repeat their district council election success in the LegCo elections in September? Next question. Do you agree with applying Benny Tai's past strategy for the upcoming Legislative Council elections? If not, what is the best strategy for winning as many seats and to prevent a split in the pan-democratic vote? If the pan-democratic camp, against all odds, wins the majority, would China repeat the events of 1997 when a provisional legislative council superseded the elected assembly of 1995? Then, will potential sanctions from the US have any impact on the situation? Then, how do you respond to China when they say there was no democracy during 150 years of British rule either? Then, oh, sorry, I got that. There is a few weeks ago, Richard Tsoi withdrew from his position after he was criticized for making remarks about anti-mainland Chinese xenophobia by some Hong Kong restaurants refusing to serve Cantonese speakers. I would be interested in your comment on this discussion within the Pandem camp. Then, between, and I keep reading, you still take notes, please. Between the 14th and the 19th of April, we have seen a series of interferences of Beijing into Hong Kong affairs. The arrests have been the most reported. Do you see a real risk that the Hong Kong government could introduce legislation on national security after it had failed in 2003? Then, regarding the LegCo elections, some argue that Beijing wants to push through Article 23 before the elections because they fear pro-establishment parties could fail to win a majority. How do you see the chances of the pro-democratic camp to gain 35 plus seats? Then, how about functional constituencies? How can pan-democrats win more functional constituencies? Then, after the umbrella movement, many youngsters were frustrated. Many turned localists and did not want to cooperate with the traditional pan-dems. 2020, it seems very different. The democratic movement seems to be much more united. New localists seem to be much more willing to cooperate with a new generation of pandems, such as Dennis Kwok. What, in your view, brought localists and pandems closer again? And then, how do you assess the state of Hong Kong's rule of law and the independence of Hong Kong's judiciary in light of the 15 arrests? What do you expect from those trials? And then another question. Both speakers argued that CCP did not keep its promises and legal obligations. You also argued convincingly that it is difficult for the small Hong Kong to protect its autonomy without international support from liberal democracies. What exactly would you want the EU or EU member states to do? And then there's another, let me check whether I read that. can you please advise on what Hong Kongers can do so as to succeed in their fight and to gain more international support? And what could the international community do when one country, two systems becomes obsolete de facto? If you think the international community, particularly the European Union or a leading country like Germany, would take tangible measures when a city that is established under an international treaty being submerged by a powerful nation such as China. And then finally, there was a question. No, there are more questions. Sorry. Regarding your appeal, this goes directly to Alan. Regarding your appeal to the free world, where do you see leverage for European countries to influence Hong Kong's policy? Then another question, could you both give us a proposal of measures that you believe effective to recover some leverage over China's intervention in Hong Kong? And finally, there was a question that was going in my direction that says, and I will answer that after you have spoken. My question is actually for Mr. Bütikofer. What concrete steps can you imagine the EU taking to pressure Beijing to change its increasingly threatening approach to Hong Kong? As we have 23 minutes left, I would think that each of you should take 8 to 10 minutes, and I would start with you again, Martin, and then I will answer the question that was going in my direction also after that. Please, Martin, pick the questions you want to address. Some are overlapping, but I wanted to read them all for transparency.
Thank you. I wish the communists would do that for transparency over Hong Kong. Well, a lot of you are naturally concerned about the prospects of the Democrats winning in the forthcoming elections in September in the Legislative Council. I think it's really touch and go. I don't think it's easy at all for us to win the majority in the Legislative Council election, but nothing is impossible. For the people of Hong Kong, they would go out and vote in large numbers if they are totally annoyed with what's happening in Hong Kong, particularly brought about by the liaison office. If they claim to be the real master over Hong Kong, I think that would bring more voters to the polls to vote for us. I think there is a chance, but very, very difficult. Now, but if we do win the slight majority, what will Beijing do? I think they will do their damnedest to stop the Legislative Council for the next term with a democratic majority. They would try to disqualify certain legislators, and if they disqualify just a few of us, they will regain the majority because it takes a long time for there to be by-elections. And during that period, they would certainly have a window of opportunity of passing any draconian law they like. For example, the Article 23 legislation or the national security legislation. At the moment, there is every chance that the liaison office would certainly like that legislation to be passed into law even before the elections. But the pro-Beijing legislators are afraid that if they push too hard, they would be effectively pushing more voters into the voting booth to support us. And so Tam Yu-zhong, who was mentioned by Helen just a moment ago, he was certainly a pro-Beijing guy. He is the only Hong Kong person sitting on the Senate Committee of the National People's Congress, lately said that he doesn't think there is enough time for that to be done before the elections are held. He is afraid of bringing us more votes. Now, the younger people, of course, do not agree with older folks like us in how to fight for democracy. To them, we have not done well at all. To them, we have wasted a lot of time by keeping China to her promises. So some of them want to use some force. Now, on television screens, you would have seen a lot of fiery Molotov cocktails and so on. But recently, it has been discovered during a trial that in fact, some of these incidents where Molotov cocktails were thrown into police headquarters or living quarters, not against people, but only on the walls or in the yards of their residential areas of police officers, were actually done by members of the police themselves. So there is evidence in court now, which has always been my suspicion, because it's so easy. You can just wear black and have a funny looking mask in black, and people would take you to be a protester. But of course, you could be a policeman, and you can just throw things into your own living quarters, not harming people, of course, and people will put the blame on the protesters. So I think it would be interesting for the judge to decide later on, who are these people resorting to violence in the full view of the TV cameras? I don't know. But we know now there's actual evidence in the court that certain of these incidents were actually engineered by policemen themselves in protesters' clothing. So now we do not share the same tactics. We still believe in peace and harmony as our weapon. I believe that we should stand on our high moral ground and continue to hold China to this contract. That's why China hits at us. All these years, I have never advocated for independence of Hong Kong, because under the Joint Declaration and the Basic Law, Hong Kong is part of China. But I want China to adhere to her own promises. And for that, they call me a traitor. How could I be a traitor when I want the Chinese government to adhere to its own promises, not only set out in the treaty between Britain and China, signed in 1984, signed in 1985, and also enshrined in our own basic law, our mini constitution, drafted on behalf of China. So how could I be condemned as a traitor for doing that? It shows how much worried they are about the lack of merits in the argument in the case. So they now say, instead of following the basic law provision so that they would be ruled by Hong Kong laws, they now say they are above the Hong Kong laws. They would tell our courts even what to do. They can interfere, they say, because we have supervisory power over the whole of Hong Kong, over the government, over the legislature. So how do you conduct meetings in the legislature? They would tell you what to do, and also the courts. And so this clearly is wrong, and they should know they are wrong. This is against Deng Xiaoping's own promises. They know that. That's why they keep on arguing. They keep on frightening Hong Kong people, arresting us to make sure that there's no open dissent. They will yell at you guys if you try to defend Hong Kong's, our freedoms and so on. But remember and tell them that they lobbied for your support back in the early 1980s when the Basic Law was first announced. So you have at least a moral obligation to speak up for Hong Kong people. Same for Europe, same for Germany, same for France. So please take the moral high ground, defend Hong Kong's freedoms, make sure that we get democracy. That was promised. And make sure there's no interference with Beijing. That also was promised. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Alan, your turn, please.
Thank you. There are so many questions. I would deal with the more important answers first. First of all, on what Europe can do, given the dire situation in Hong Kong. I have to thank the European Parliament and Reinhard in particular for having procured the passage of a couple of very important resolutions during your last sitting. I mean, your last 4 years. One of the most important resolutions was, of course, the one passed on the 20th anniversary of the reversion of sovereignty of Hong Kong to mainland China in the year 2017. Right? That was a very comprehensive resolution reciting all that happened in Hong Kong in the first 20 years after reversion of sovereignty, and also putting your foot down on how to help Hong Kong to continue with that promised autonomy and one country, two systems. That is, of course, one way of doing it. And only recently, as recently as the 22nd of April, I think over 30 MEPs expressed their concern over the arrest of Martin Lee, together with other 14 politicians and advocates for democracy. And I certainly thank them for writing those open letters. This is a way that you are showing to Hong Kong people that you are concerned about us, who have been sharing your core values, institutions like the rule of law, core values like freedom, human rights, etc. So continue with this kind of effort. I think that is important. I don't know whether you know about this or not, but in my recent visits to the Houses of Parliament in the UK, they were drawing my attention to the all-party parliamentary group on Hong Kong. And that is a very important platform to gather together members of the UK Parliament who are concerned about Hong Kong, who want to see that the Brits would not forget about their obligations and duties to Hong Kong after having handed us over to the CCP in 1997. So you may consider in the European Parliament doing something like the APPG, the all-party parliamentary group on Hong Kong. That is also very helpful. All right, so I think two questions addressed in particular Article 23 legislation, the national security legislation, which the CCP and the Hong Kong SAR government failed to push through almost 20 years ago in the year 2003. Now, from the look of things, I think there is every intention on the part of the CCP with the cooperation of Hong Kong SAR government to do that ASAP, as soon as possible. Now, whether they would use very draconian methods like incorporating the national security laws in mainland China through Annex 3 of our basic law, I don't know. But my take of what the CCP has done recently is that they have now shown us, and probably the world as well, their bottom line. So they are saying, oh, our bottom line is, don't threaten national security of China. Well, meaning, don't threaten the existence of CCP. Now, but I'm afraid that they have never learned. In the past 20 years, they have been coming down on Hong Kong like tons of bricks without honoring or giving us any hope that they would honor the promises enshrined in the basic law. So if they continue with this kind of approach, then of course they would want the national security laws to be passed into domestic laws as soon as possible. Now, but with the coronavirus pandemic, and peoples of the world are now really very much against the CCP for the way that it had handled the pandemic by not making timely disclosure, etc., of details about the pandemic. I think the CCP will have to think twice. As of now, I think they are just talking to threaten us with national security legislation, with their supervisory power over Hong Kong affairs, etc. But if liberal democracies who have stakes in Hong Kong are determined to stay in Hong Kong and to really continue to pursue what they had started 20 years ago, at the time they supported the accession of China to WTO, then I think the CCP would begin to talk some sense. Of course, I'm not asking you to put a gun to his head. This is not the way to deal with CCP. But you can deal with CCP very firmly by pointing out that it is in our mutual interest for the CCP to respect the Sino-British Joint Declaration and the Basic Law, so that the rest of the world can have a reason to trust that the CCP may one day be converted to harboring the same core values and institutions. So in short, I'm saying that the coronavirus is giving us a breathing space, or it is serving as an alarm clock to wake up peoples of the world, particularly of liberal democracies, so that all these peoples will then do something to direct their own governments to do the right thing. And hopefully in the whole process, in the way that I would envisage it taking place, everybody will benefit. Hong Kong, Europe, liberal democracies, and China, the Chinese people, 1.4 billion Chinese people as well. Now, very quickly on a few other, okay, so I just stop there.
Sorry, Alan, time is running out. I will give each of you the chance for a couple of final remarks at the end of the webinar, but I would also want to address the question that was coming my way. Let me start by saying, first of all, just as Martin said, nobody on our side in the European Parliament is questioning that Hong Kong is a part of China, and we will not question that in the future either. And that implies that we are not, as Europeans, we are not there to decide the future of Hong Kong. That's for the people of Hong Kong to shape their own future. That's what we support. We would highlight, and I think this has to be given more emphasis, as both of you did, that the one country, two systems approach was not just based on the Basic Law, it's also based on an international treaty, which is the Sino-British Joint Declaration, and there is an international obligation of the government in Beijing to honor that agreement that they struck. And I would say that this is one element of European foreign policy that we have to emphasize. I also would want to pick up the example that you highlighted, Alan, when you spoke of the APPG in the House of Commons. To say it colloquially, a group of friends of Hong Kong. I think there has been so much support for the democracy movement in Hong Kong expressed in resolutions that the European Parliament passed from all sides of the political spectrum that I think there would be a good chance of forming such a group also in the European Parliament, and I think we should be going for that. And thirdly, we have engaged in the past as a European Parliament also with efforts to create a global human rights sanctions mechanism of the European Union, comparable to what the United States have with their Magnitsky Act, their global Magnitsky Act. This is under consideration in the Council at the moment, but I would hope that we would create such an instrument to also more effectively push back against those actors that do not only denounce but also undermine in practical terms human rights and civic rights. So these are the three dimensions of what I see us doing in the future, and of course we will also try to contribute to in the future to create transparency about what's going on in Hong Kong and give opportunity of learning also from the democratic camp. With that, I would want to return to both of you and give you a final word, 1 minute each. Please, Martin.
Thank you. Hong Kong is the key to China. Because if you look at how China deals with Hong Kong, you can expect what China can also do with the rest of the world. But for whatever reason, you don't like the Chinese Communist Party, don't put your hatred on the Chinese people, because the Chinese people are the victims. Remember that. And think of the freedom of the press, how important it is if Hong Kong can still keep the freedom of the press, if Hong Kong can still be the one city in China where overseas reporters can freely report and report the truth about the coronavirus and things like that. And if these foreign journalists are no longer allowed to report in Hong Kong, think of the damage to the rest of the world. So think of Hong Kong, because that is the way you can protect yourselves better. Thank you.
Thank you. Alan.
I think Hong Kong is still an indispensable international financial center for China, mainland. About 80% of direct foreign investments go through Hong Kong into the country. And also, so long as Forex control is still in force in China, Hong Kong is an important place where renminbi would be exchanged into internationally traded currencies. Notwithstanding the immense pressure being brought to bear on Hong Kong, I can tell our friends in Europe that Hong Kong people are still in very good spirit. We are hanging in here, and we would not forget our goal is to preserve the 122 systems and all our values and institutions. So do keep an eye on Hong Kong, and Hong Kong is a good example of what will happen if you do nothing at this time to modify and adjust the way that you're dealing with the CCP.
Thank you very much, both Alan Leung and Martin Lee, and a lot of strength to you and a lot of success also, and we will stay in touch. And thanks to all the other participants of this webinar. It ends here. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye.